Many of you will recall the music to the opening, the soundtrack to the opening of 2001: A Space Odyssey, even if you won't recall that video because that was something that was produced using Runway just a few weeks ago. But the theme of the movie, the theme of videos, is going to be central to what I'm going to be talking about today, and indeed the theme of science fiction. 2001: A Space Odyssey was, of course, a collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. And it's been voted by the critics at one stage as the greatest movie of all time. I'm going to be referring to science fiction throughout this movie, throughout this presentation. And to some extent, I'm trying to claim that, in fact, much of what's happening today is based on some of the kind of predictions and the stories that were going on in movies such as that. The other extraordinary thing about the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey is that it includes AI on several different levels. Most famously and most obviously, perhaps, tells a story of the ship's, the spacecraft's supercomputer HAL 9000, that at one stage it progressively tries to eliminate all the astronauts on board ship. And this itself kind of falls into, I guess, a trope of a kind of fear of technology, a fear of robots, a fear of computers that has a long history in the movie industry, going back to Metropolis and no doubt beyond, but also including movies such as Blade Runner. This fear of the computer is something that is endemic, I would say, to everything. And of course, in that movie, there's a famous point where Hal refuses to obey. I think it's Dave, and he makes this comment, "I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave." And then eventually, what happens, having been kind of ousted out of the ship, is the astronaut comes back and eventually switches Hal off. But there's also another side of the movie that perhaps is less easy to follow, much more enigmatic, but it suggests a completely different approach towards artificial intelligence and towards technology in general. The opening scene shows a monolith. Now, although that monolith might elicit a certain degree of suspicion among most people, it is actually a benign monolith. It's been put there by the firstborns. This is an extraterrestrial species that Arthur C. Clarke writes about. Eventually, they become dematerialized and become pure intelligence. And they put the monolith there with the express intention of trying to encourage the development of human civilization. It's a kind of catalyst, shall we say, towards that. And in that opening scene, we see a bunch of pre-human kind of ape-like figures who, first of all, encounter this thing, and then, presumably as a direct impact of the influence on the monolith, invent or discover the first tool, which is a bone. Let me just play you a brief segment of that. So what it's portraying are effectively the two sides of AI, or the two sides of computation, the terrifying side of it, and also the more benign side of it, the possibility that actually AI will help us. And this twist, but double-sidedness is really a central part of the movie. When I was writing about AI in the first place, I began to realize this dichotomy, something that Elon Musk, a figure that I'm going to talk about a lot today, was also troubled by. It is both something that he's using a lot in SpaceX and in Neuralink and in his Tesla cars, especially self-driving cars. He's using AI, but he's also warning us it could be the end of civilization. I then contacted my publishers, Bloomsbury, who were going to publish my book, and persuaded them that really I should turn the book into two different books, one with a white cover about the positive side of technology, of AI, and also one with a black cover about the dark side of technology, about the Black Mirror episode as it were, of technology. Now, my view about AI is it's simply a tool. It's nothing negative in itself, but it's a very, very powerful tool. And it's because it's so powerful, potentially it could be a threat to us human beings. Hello and welcome then to the third in our series on artificial general intelligence. This is intended as the introduction. It's slightly it's maybe in the wrong order. It was intended to be first, but we had to move Joshua Barker to be first because he wasn't available later on. And so I'm coming in third, rather disturbingly right after the presentation of Stuart Russell and also Joshua Barker himself, two astonishingly very powerful presentations. Now, I'm not going to be talking about AI at the level that Stuart Russell was, because I simply can't, but I'm going to be talking about it, shall we say, as a kind of theorist, more, I guess, in the manner of someone like Yuval Harari. So this is seen as an introduction to artificial general intelligence, and I'm entitling it Alien Intelligence. And there's a theme of the alien that you saw in that the first clip of these, or the second clip rather, where an alien intelligence has had an impact on how the world has developed. Let me simply say also that I'm not going to offer any tips on how to use AI. But if you log into our Digital Futures International website and go to our YouTube channel, you'll find there's a series of tutorials that are going on that are accompanying this particular series. The AGI series is on a Sunday, and on the day before, the Saturday, we're having a series of tutorials about how you use this. And if you follow me on Instagram, or if you follow Digital Futures on Instagram, you will get information about what is coming up. So let me start off by talking a bit about AI in general. Now, I'm not going to talk about what architects think of AI, but let me just use this in the background for those who are not familiar with architects' use of AI, just to show them what we think about it. Essentially, there are many ways of thinking about what AI is, and Melanie Mitchell lays out a number of them in some of her podcasts. I want to pick up on two in particular. One, the idea that AI is simply a toolkit, a box of tools that we can use, Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on and so on and so on, Look, Xcool, Sora, and so on. And then it's also a kind of broad field of research within the area of computer science, trying to produce a form of intelligence that in some way is trying to emulate to some extent what the brain does, as though AI is a kind of form of digital brain. Now, that's a field that most architects are unaware of. Most of them are obsessed by the use of the tool and producing these kind of images. Well, I'm not going to talk about this today. I'm going to talk about the other side of things, the debates that are going on within the field of AI about AI itself and about the relationship between AI and the human brain. I want to talk about basically the GPT in the ChatGPT. I want to talk about large language models and why they're so successful, and effectively, therefore, why they're so scary. And above all, I want to talk about the internal feuds, the internal debates going on within the field of AI that effectively have turned the whole field, the whole scene into something of a soap opera, if not to say an episode of Black Mirror. So let me then talk about, and I'll just finish off by showing what you can produce there, but talk about, and you can work in many areas, not just the design of buildings, but also design of fashion and cars and so on. But let me talk about broadly about AGI itself, something that has been also a bit elusive. Certainly when I wrote my first book, I came across many different definitions of AGI, including one that claimed that AGI was a form of strong AI. In other words, AGI was AI with consciousness. I don't think that's correct at all now. And it seems that we've kind of coalesced into two types of definition that are not incompatible about what AGI is. On the one hand, we can talk about AGI as being a form of general purpose AI. This is a term that Stuart Russell has been using. In other words, what it means is that AI is an AI that can't just do one task. It can do many tasks. For example, if we look back at Deep Blue, which beat the IBM's computer that beat Garry Kasparov at chess, or indeed AlphaGo, DeepMind's computer that beat Lee Sedol at Go. These were systems, although very different in themselves, they were systems that really could only do one thing. But it was with a subsequent generation of AlphaGo, AlphaGo Zero, a platform a model that could not only play Go but also chess and many other games, that we began to open up into a general purpose AI. But there's also another way of understanding AGI, that is in relation to human beings. An OpenAI offers a definition of AGI as being a highly autonomous system that can outperform humans at most economically valuable work. In other words, it is comparing AI to humans. And alongside that, of course, there's a whole series of concerns about what AI can do, what AGI can do and not do. This will be the central focus in some senses of what I'm talking about today. So I want to cast this, and this is, I would say, work in progress rather than necessarily a completely finished work, but cast this in terms of different modalities, of different sort of forms of movies or television series and so on. Science fiction drama. Is it a form of science fiction drama that we're watching? And what I want to claim, and this might not be so obvious now, but hopefully it'll become clear, is that science fiction is behind all of this in a very perverse but very obvious way when you begin to uncover things. Is it a form of soap opera? We had this extraordinary event recently where Elon Musk sued Sam Altman and OpenAI and then withdrew it and then sued them again. This has all the makings of a soap opera. Or is it a form of Black Mirror episode? Is it something that is ultimately very, very terrifying? Or is it finally a form of a kind of feel-good movie that in the end will be very positive for us? So what I want to ask today is, what the hell is going on? There are all these things happening all at once. We're seeing extraordinary developments in terms of technological developments in terms of the field of AI that are thrusting us into the future. The future is upon us sooner than we thought. At the same time, there are these kind of dramas happening, these soap operas that are going on at the same time. How do we explain all this? And what lies behind all this? And the central thesis I'm going to put forward today is that actually, surprisingly, it is all informed by science fiction, or at least the work of Elon Musk is all informed by science fiction. There are then a cast of characters that we can look at if we're in this movie, whatever it is to be made. And I'm sure there'll be a whole series of movies about this coming out in the future. We've got figures such as Alan Turing, the brilliant British polymath who was part of the very beginning of computation itself and who predicted AI, even though he never wasn't even around to see the term being coined. We have Marvin Minsky, someone who has been integral to the whole series, somebody who's been both a good and sometimes a bad guy. He has been clearly a central figure within MIT Media Lab, but at the same time, there are other things that are now appearing that maybe cast him in a different light. And there's Geoffrey Hinton, who, in my mind, he is the true hero of all that we're talking about today. We have Elon Musk, this mercurial figure who is doing some extraordinary things, one of the richest men in the world, doing some extraordinary things. What on earth is behind his thinking? We have Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who was involved in all these controversies. And then we have Ilya Sutskever, the extraordinary Russian-Israeli computer scientist who was central to all the turmoil that was going on at OpenAI before he left. And finally, we have Fei-Fei Li. We only have a few female figures in this whole lineup. In fact, the other one may be Melanie Mitchell. But nonetheless, she's played an important role. If Geoffrey Hinton is going to be known as the godfather of AI and certainly the godfather of deep learning, then maybe Fei-Fei Li is to be known as the godmother of AI. And I want to sort of I want to sort of portray the history of AI as being a kind of accidental history where often there were some intentions that never, there were some very clear intentions, that things that never materialized, and then things that happen as though by accident that really propelled AI forward. Happy accidents. It's a kind of curious accidental history. So we can start off perhaps with Alan Turing, the person who first conceptualized the possibility of computers being connected to intelligence. And as we now know, he was central in the Second World War to cracking the Nazi Enigma code using a form of proto-computer. And what makes him so interesting is that he was a doctor, someone with a PhD in science and technology, who basically saved the world, or at least saved many millions of people by effectively bringing the Second World War to an end before it might otherwise have come to an end. As such, and as someone who was brought up in the UK, I've always been thinking of him in terms of Doctor Who. Doctor Who, after all, is not a medical doctor. He's a doctor. He's with a PhD in science and technology. And unlike someone like James Bond or any other of these kind of figures, he never gets involved in fistfights. He solves the problems in the world, a bit like Alan Turing, through the application of science and technology. Indeed, at one point, I suspected that maybe Alan Turing, Dr. Alan Turing, could have been the figure behind this science fiction series of Doctor Who, behind Doctor Who itself. Of course, in fact, that from a strict chronological point of view, that cannot have been the case, because Doctor Who was first broadcast in the 1960s, and Alan Turing, who himself died in 1954, but we think by suicide, the secrets about what he did, or the stories about what he did in the Second World War, were not released until the 1970s, because they were protected by the Official Secrets Act. In other words, we didn't know about what Dr. Alan Turing had done when Doctor Who was launched. But then again, Doctor Who is a Time Lord, and the rules of time do not apply to him. There have been a number of mistakes in AI thinking, for example, that AI would be easy. So when AI was first launched, or at least the term itself was coined, it was coined in 1955 for an event that was going to take place in 1956 in Dartmouth College in the States. And it was coined by this figure at the bottom here, John McCarthy, who might be this figure, I'm not sure. But what we're seeing here, the original, the smart minds in the States who came together for this particular event. This is Claude Shannon here, Marvin Minsky, who we see here later on, who became a central figure in MIT Media Lab. But when they met again, and the bottom right-hand figure is an illustration, is when they had a reunion 50 years later in 2006, again in Dartmouth College, they had to confess that really they had achieved almost nothing in those first 50 years, despite their aspirations. And their aspirations were to solve the basic problems of AI within 2 years. That didn't happen. In fact, they faced challenges after challenges. In particular, one of the primary purposes of AI, or the primary uses of AI, they thought at the time, was to translate, especially to translate Russian to understand what the Soviets were saying. But AI proved to be, or their version of AI proved to be, singularly inadequate at translating Russian. There was a famous example where they tried to translate the American expression "out of sight is out of mind," and it came out as "an invisible lunatic." AI was not doing what they hoped to do. It had achieved nothing in the first 50 years, and they all predicted that it would achieve nothing either in the following 50 years. But by a strange coincidence, 2006 was roughly the time when things began to take off and neural networks began to really be effective and deep learning kicked in. So on the one hand, we could probably see this figure, Marvin Minsky, who has been, I think, universally acclaimed within the history of AI, as being in the movie version of it, the exaggerated movie of it, has been the dastardly villain of the piece. Marvin Minsky, after all, had written this book with Seymour Papert back in the 60s about perceptrons effectively trashing neural networks and pointing out they were not able to do anything, and they were useless. And in the competition between the various approaches, neural networks, which are known as connectionism, then at that point was abandoned, and most people were focusing on symbolic AI, the dominant approach. And they were useless. But sorry, based on logic. Now, there was another accident in this whole process that actually contributed towards this. Frank Rosenblatt, the person who had invented perceptrons, looked promising at the time, died in a boating accident. And without their leading protagonist, it was clear that the whole world of neural networks was going to fall out of favor. But Minsky also has been caught up in other things. The whole series of the Epstein scandal. He was caught, as it were, with his pants down. Should we let this obscure or his other contributions? I don't know. But what I would say is the real hero of AI, or the hero of neural networks, is undoubtedly this person, Geoffrey Hinton. Geoffrey Hinton comes from a very distinguished family in the UK. His great-great-grandfather was George Boole of Boolean geometry fame, and he himself has had a very distinguished career. He actually spent 2 days studying architecture at the University of Cambridge, where I myself studied. And then he changed and eventually we went into natural sciences, and eventually we did a PhD in Edinburgh on AI. But in some senses, so it took him 2 days to decide he wasn't going to do architecture. When I mentioned this at a conference with one of my colleagues from Foster and Partners, she said, he's smart. It took me 5 years to realize that architecture was not for me. Anyway, we can be thankful he didn't stick in architecture, and he moved into the world of AI. And Hinton was convinced that the way forward was not symbolic AI, it was not through logic, but by modeling AI on the brain. And even though neural networks were completely out of favor, he stubbornly persisted. He stubbornly persisted with having to adopt certain strategies, like scrub any reference to neural networks in any paper that he had submitted in order to get it accepted. But eventually, by another happy accident, this proved to be the right approach. It was the invention of GPUs, graphic processing units, that had a huge impact, not only on training the neural networks themselves, but also in speeding up computers and making them more powerful. Now, this itself was completely accidental, because GPUs were invented for gaming. They weren't intended to make computers more powerful, but everyone discovered that they work this way. And from the moment when they were discovered, from 1999, it took a while before it fed into the world of computation. But roughly around 2006, they were experimenting with using these to make the computers more powerful. And we had, as a result, what's called the deep learning revolution. The deep learning means neural networks, it means connectionism, and it means this alternative approach. And this is the dominant approach now being used in AI. If you refer to AI these days, almost certainly you're referring to deep learning. ChatGPT is deep learning. Midjourney is deep learning. Sora is deep learning, and so on, and so on, and so on. And we can think of these a bit like Russian dolls nested inside each other. Deep learning is part of machine learning, which is part of the broader category of artificial intelligence. But the difference between the use of the term AI from the very beginnings back in 1956 to what we got now is incommensurable. It is absolutely enormous. The power of these computers is vastly, vastly superior. It was actually in 2012 that we actually eventually everyone realized how powerful these neural networks would be. There was a competition, the ImageNet competition, that had been set up by Fei Li, then a PhD student at Princeton, but since then she's become a very central figure at Stanford. And she basically she launched this series of competitions to see who could recognize images, image recognition, something that we take for granted these days. We all have facial recognition on our cameras, but back in 2012, that didn't exist. We had no facial recognition, and this was a huge breakthrough. And what happened was that Geoffrey Hinton and his team, that included Ilya Sutskever, came along with their neural network. And of course, this was regarded as an obsolete technology. It was a bit like the steam engine. No one was using neural networks, but they came along and they wiped the floor. They won by a country mile. It was absolutely astonishing. Now, Fei Li writes about this in her autobiography, and maybe she's exaggerating, but this is the way she puts it. It was as though, as she puts it, it was as though the world's speed record was beaten by 100 miles an hour by someone driving a Honda Civic. It was simply astonishing, absolutely astonishing. But that was the moment when suddenly we began to realize that neural networks worked, and they worked better than any other approach. And almost overnight, everyone started saying, well, of course, I always thought that neural networks were the way forward. And that was the beginning of the deep learning revolution really kicking in. But to recognize an image was fine. But the holy grail for computer science was not to recognize an image, but to generate an image, to synthesize an image, to hallucinate an image. And that happened soon afterwards when Alex Morvintsev, an engineer working for Google, discovered that you could simply invert the network. In other words, you could reverse the flow instead of going from the image on the left-hand side through these hidden layers. And the term deep learning refers to the number of hidden layers, and they can be anything up to 5,000. And it works itself feed forward from left to right to eventually come up with the conclusion it's a bird, never 100%, normally 99%, but it comes up with this conclusion. Well, what Morvintsev discovered is that you could simply reverse it. You could start with the word bird, and you could go from right to left. Instead of going from bird to the picture to the word, you go from the word to the picture. And this produced something called Deep Dream, a completely trippy, hallucinatory series of images that had no sense of where things should be because they'd lost their information about where to position things. They were pose invariant, as they put it in the field. But nonetheless, it produced something, the first ever computer-generated images. And this, in fact, this is now known as Deep Dream, that was behind the first ever exhibition of AI-generated art that was curated by Blaise Aguirre-Arcos, who will be with us in a couple of weeks. This was a sensation in many ways. But that really didn't take us very far. And the next step really was the introduction of generative adversarial networks by Ian Goodfellow, also in Canada. I should say that Geoffrey Hinton was based in the University of Toronto, and Ian Goodfellow was based in Montreal, but he was doing a PhD there. And he came up with this concept in the pub one night with his mates about what he called the generative adversarial network that has now become a household name and had transformed things. And this is what a generative adversarial network does. It has two networks. One, the generator on the left-hand side that is taking random noise and producing images that then the discriminator is judging against a training set. If it's not convinced by the standard of the image, it will reject it. And in rejecting it, it forces the generator to improve its game. And as a result, we get a much better image coming through. It's a bit like the model of the tutor, the architectural the tutor in the studio, telling the student it's not good enough, go back and do it again and get it better. And this is what led to the next breakthrough. And we started producing images that were much more convincing. Now, in architecture, we were way, way behind all of this. And in 2019, I proposed to curate the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, teaming up with Zaha Hadid Architects and teaming up with Refik Anadol, who is now something of a rock star. Well, he is a rock star in the world of media art. And we are going to be sponsored by Google, by Blaise Aguirre-Arcos. This, to my mind, was an absolute dream team. You couldn't have got a better team together. But when I applied, we didn't even get shortlisted. It is shortlisted. It is as though in 2019, AI simply wasn't on the agenda within the field of architecture. Anyway, Refik Anadol decided to do what we were planning to do in the first place, and that is to try and hallucinate or generate images of buildings. And so he collected as much data as possible of the work of Zaha Hadid, as many images as possible, and trained a style GAN to produce an image. And eventually we get this, the first ever GAN-generated design, architectural design, or a design, shall we say, that was ever produced and that I used on the front cover of my book that came out in December 2021 and was out of date within a few months. There are a series of other GANs that were then developed, including cycle GANs, which instead of where style GANs were simply a finite group, and what it effectively meant was that you were averaging or blending or finding something between a finite set. With this one, cycle GANs, you were effectively breeding this because you were taking two data sets. In this case, one of them being a data set of the work of Corp Himmelblau, and breeding that off against, and I think this is based on geological formations. This is the work of Daniel Bolojan, who I think is one of the leading figures, if not the leading figure, in the world of AI and architecture, still working with Corp Himmelblau, and also a professor at Florida Atlantic University. Now, Daniel Bolojan was, at the time, we were producing this. This was the state of the art. This was the best that we had at the time. The problem was with all this was that it was hard to produce. It took a long time to train a GAN, and you had to be a computational expert, someone like Daniel Bolojan in the first place to be able to do it, and the resolution wasn't great, and so on and so on and so on. Nonetheless, this is what we had at the time, and it was the state of the art. You can see how glitchy the images are, and if the images aren't glitchy, then you know there's been some post-production because they're almost all entirely glitchy. And this was the project that we put on the front cover of our AD. The next book that I was involved in that came out in April 2022. There was actually a slew of books on architecture, AI and architecture, all of which were out of date very soon because of the next development, which was the development of the diffusion model. Now, the diffusion model, which had been produced by OpenAI initially, the second version, DALL-E 2, wasn't released till later in the year, but in early 2022, there were some examples that were coming out and were in social media that were causing quite a stir. Diffusion models will operate in a very different way. They're not based on competing neural networks. They're based on a diffusion process that first of all uses Gaussian noise to disrupt an image and then repairs it. It kind of reverses that process. And they're based on pre-trained models, giant pre-trained models that someone else has prepared. And they're based also on text to image logic. In other words, we use prompts. And here is a very basic prompt, an astronaut on a horse. But it in a way, it really shows the example of the potential of this, because what it produces, even though there'd never been probably a photograph of an astronaut on a horse before, it synthesizes what that might have been. And I want to emphasize here, AI does not copy. Humans copy, not very well, but we copy. AI never copies. But nonetheless, this was the most important thing to come out, the diffusion model. And what's more, what is so astonishing, of course, it does it in about 3 seconds. So this caused something of a revolution. And when I mentioned this, and I mentioned the DALL-E 2 in a lecture at the Architectural Association in May 2022, I was saying, when are architects going to wake up to this? And there was a voice in the audience, Patrick Schumacher, who's going to be with us in a couple of weeks' time. And Patrick said, we've already come to that. We already discovered what it can do. And unbeknown to me and many other people, he'd been collaborating with Refik Anadol, who had access to that model and had been producing these kind of images that were clearly much better than the first GAN-generated images. Anyway, the rest is history. Midjourney actually was the first one to become available. I think it was in July of 2022. Eventually, DALL-E 2 became available to the general public. But Midjourney is the one that has really captured our imagination. There's also Stable Diffusion and LookX, which is based on Stable Diffusion. All these models are causing something of a stir. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about this, but as it were, the rest is history. One of the constant mistakes that we've been making, and this goes throughout history, is that we have underestimated the potential of AI. This is a conversation that took place, I think it was in 2019, between Elon Musk and Jack Ma in Shanghai in China. And Elon Musk makes what seems to be a pretty crass comments. Human beings can never create another thing that is smarter than human beings. Well, it might be crass, but probably a lot of people think that. And Elon Musk corrects him. I very much disagree with that. The biggest mistake that I see people making is to assume they're smart in comparison to AI. People underestimate the capability of AI. They sort of think it's like a smart human, but it's going to be much smarter than the smartest human you will ever know. And how right he was. So going back through history, there are a number of incidents where events which kind of showcase the potential of AI, where consistently we had always overrated the human opponent. Gary Kasparov in 1997 took on Deep Blue, the IBM's computer, and nobody thought that Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players of all time, would lose to a computer. But lose he did. And he made this comment afterwards: we just have to understand that everything that we know how to do, machines will eventually do better than us. Now, it's not to say that's going to happen all at the same time in each field. Clearly at chess, it's way superior, but there are certain other fields where machines are struggling to catch up. There's something called Moravec's paradox, which basically says that what we're good at, AI is not very good at, machines are not very good at, and what machines are good at, we're not very good at. So, for example, catching a ball is very challenging for a machine these days still, whereas some of the things that ChatGPT does are simply astonishing. Summarizing a book in 3 seconds, we could not do that. Anyway, the next step, which really I think brought this home to certainly the Go playing nations of the world, China, Korea, Japan, and so on, was the match that took place between AlphaGo, produced by DeepMind in London, with whom Demis Hassabis, who's another one of those characters, I should say, on the movie script. Demis Hassabis was behind this, and again, nobody thought that Lee Sedol, its opponent, one of the greatest Go players of all time, would be beaten by AI. It was simply impossible. But there was a significant shift between the game of chess and this game of Go, and that is because Go, although it's straightforward in some ways in terms of its potential moves, is infinitely complicated in terms of its potential moves, because there are more potential moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe. So to achieve this, they had to move beyond the expert systems. The systems have simply been trained by brute force that were used, for example, for the match against Gary Kasparov, to use learning systems, deep learning. And this 2016 was been described as the Sputnik moment for the Go playing nations. The Sputnik moment being the moment when originally when America woke up to how successful the Soviets were in the space race when they launched their satellite Sputnik, and that led to the foundation of NASA and to the eventually Apollo 11 going to the moon and so on. It was all triggered off by this one Sputnik moment. And in that match, there were a number of particular moves that were a bit puzzling, so-called slack moves, because their significance was not so clear until later on. But there was one particular move that's gone down in history as being very, very significant, and that was a move in game 2, move 37. So this is Lee Sedol talking about game 1. Yesterday, game 1, I was surprised. But today, after game 2, I am speechless. He was speechless because of this one particular move, move 37, which involves this black stone here, which is put on the 5th line, unusually not the 3rd or the 4th, as normally happens at the beginning of a match. And it looked to be a mistake. and all the commentators thought it was a mistake. But 100 moves later, it teamed up with these two black stones and won the match. It was as though it was thinking 100 moves ahead. So let's just hear the commentators on what they thought about that particular move.
From the Google team was talking about is this kind of evaluation value.
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
But it was no mistake. And this was Lisa Dahl's comment afterward. AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. I don't think this is the most significant thing about the match. Personally, I think what's very clear is AlphaGo was operating off the spectrum of human intelligence, off the spectrum. In other words, we couldn't understand what it was doing. It's a bit like those of you who have dogs will know that a dog has a greater sense of smell or a greater sense of hearing than we have. Dogs can smell things we can't smell. They can hear things we can't hear. AI, I would say, is capable of operating at a level we simply cannot understand, and it's going to get even more extreme. If, as Mo Gaudet predicts, that AI is going to have an IQ of 1,500 in a few years' time, we will not be able to understand what it's doing. The comparison has been made, it's a bit like a 2-year-old kid talking to Einstein. AI will be the Einstein and we will be the 2-year-old kid. But if we think this was impressive, I think the next generation AlphaGo 0 was even more impressive. Not only was this one of the first demonstrations of AGI, of general purpose AI, because it could play different games, but also it was astonishing because it taught itself to play Go. It acquired an understanding of Go without being given the rules of Go. And it did this by using reinforcement learning, a rewards-based approach towards learning, and playing an astonishing number of games against itself. The fact that it could teach itself to play Go without knowing the rules is astonishing in itself, but even more astonishing was the rate at which it did this. 3.9 million games of Go. It's played 3.9 million games of Go against itself in 3 days. Now that sounds like a huge amount, but when you think about it, it really is an astonishing amount, absolutely astonishing amount. And it effectively amounts to 20 games of Go every second. 20 games of Go every second. It's able to play 20 games of Go every second. Now, that is just beyond our comprehension. This is a movie of a hummingbird, which has admittedly been slowed down. You can see the hummingbird beating its wings at roughly 3 beats per second. Now imagine 7 times that speed. 7 times that speed. This was a moment that really I think we should have been paying more attention to, because it was beginning to give us a glimpse of some of the things that caused such concern more recently. AI learning to do things that it wasn't trained to do and simply being so much faster than human beings in its operations. The next thing then, in terms of the happy mistakes, was the large language model. When I say happy mistakes, it was obviously planned, but nobody predicted quite how effective or successful these so-called large language models were. Let me simply say that large language model is a term that is a complete understatement. These are gigantic pre-trained neural networks trained on trillions of bits of information and billions of parameters, absolutely enormous, and they're scaling up every time in a kind of astonishingly exponential rate, to the point that we're actually running out of data on which to train them. Now, what is interesting about these large language models is that they're not computationally so advanced. They maybe are based on 200 lines of code, quite straightforward in some sense. But what is happening is the more the data on which they are trained, the more they are exhibiting astonishing capabilities, referred to as emergent capabilities or emergent abilities. ChatGPT is able to translate, it's able to write code, and it's going to get more and more capable as the years go on. These, again, are skills in which it was not trained. This led to, so ChatGPT itself was another thing that I think had been underestimated. It was a kind of happy accident. In fact, the actual launch of ChatGPT, and this is not often spoken about, but it's a truly astonishing fact, is the fact that it was launched November the 30th, I think it was, in 2022. But at the beginning of that month, the beginning of November, OpenAI had no intention of launching ChatGPT at all. At the time, they were working on GPT-4, and it was still spewing out hate speech and God knows what else, and they weren't ready to release it. But they wanted to do something to try and keep up with their competitors. So in the end, they decided to just test out the market, what they called a low-key research preview, by launching what became known as a chatbot. And they were using GPT 3.5, and they basically tested it out. They launched it. Let's see what happens when we put it out into the market. This term, low-key research preview, came back to haunt them because, of course, ChatGPT proved to be a sensation. It was in many ways the real Sputnik moment for society in finding out about AI. Well, at this point, things are getting a little bit scary because AI is able to do things. These large language models in particular are able to do things, and we're getting a bit alarmed by this. Hold on a second. What's happening exactly? So there was a number of things that happened at the time, including a letter that was published by Max Tegmark's group looking at the future of humanity, and it was signed by people like Elon Musk, and basically saying, let's slow down this research until we know precisely what's going on. And this is the letter that the Future of Life Institute published. Pause giant AI experiments, an open letter. We call on all AI labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. And what I find interesting is that at the very end, a few paragraphs later, it mentions these emergent capabilities. This does not mean a pause on AI development in general, merely a stepping back from the dangerous race to ever large, unpredictable black box models with emergent capabilities. It expressly mentions these emergent capabilities. Now, the chances of this working were pretty remote, in my view, in the very first place. As Geoffrey Hinton says, once you've got Microsoft and Google competing against each other, this is not going to have any effect. To my mind, it's a bit like asking the two leaders in the Olympic marathon to slow down. Of course, they're not going to slow down because their rivals are all going to catch up. Anyway, the letter itself, unfortunately, and Stuart Russell was also part of this, a signatory to it, proved to be completely ineffective. But what is interesting is that Elon Musk, who had signed the letter, then decides to do precisely the opposite. Having called for these for this slowing down on these models, he then goes all in. He then goes all in into creating a supercomputer to produce superintelligence, the next stage beyond AGI, the Colossus, which he's teaming up with NVIDIA and others. So what are we to make of this? There's simply some kind of game going on, and Elon Musk has now decided, well, it's safe. Let me do it. Don't worry about it. I'll be safe. Anyway, this brings us to AGI itself and the role of AGI in this soap opera. And it is a soap opera. So I want to start off then by, or continue then by referring to this lawsuit, this curious lawsuit. Elon Musk sues Sam Altman and OpenAI. Why did he do this? Well, it was all to do with AGI, with artificial general intelligence. It was also all to do with the fact that, and this is just simply the comment by OpenAI, our mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence, AI systems that are generally smarter than humans, benefits all of humanity. We believe our research will eventually lead to artificial general intelligence, a system that can solve human-level problems. Building safe and beneficial AGI is our mission. That final statement is maybe a little bit controversial or a little bit suspect. They're claiming they're interested in safe AGI. They're claiming that's their mission. But this is OpenAI declaring what they're doing. So Elon Musk sues OpenAI, accusing it of putting profit before humanity. The principal reason was the term AGI was originally, OpenAI was originally set up as a non-profit research company with the idea of maybe countering Google, of offering something to benefit all of humanity, unconstrained by a need to generate financial return. Since our research is free from financial obligations, we can better focus on a positive human impact. And Elon Musk claims that he's responsible for suggesting the name OpenAI. So OpenAI was a non-profit company that was not interested in money, was interested in making this available for everyone else. Then things began to shift. Sam Altman becomes the CEO in 2019, and there's this agreement with Microsoft, which is very, very curious. One of the hardline commercial companies. How can a non-profit team up with Microsoft, you might ask? Well, the point is about this, that the agreement was that Microsoft could draw upon the work of OpenAI up until it reached AGI, OpenAI's pre-AGI technology. So just to clarify, and most critically, the Microsoft license only applied to OpenAI's pre-AGI technology. Microsoft obtained no rights to AGI, and it was up to OpenAI's non-profit board, not Microsoft, to determine when OpenAI had attained AGI. So it was all about AGI. Microsoft could collaborate, could work with OpenAI up until the arrival of AGI. Now, the problem is that some have argued that AGI was that maybe GPT-4 had reached AGI. So what was happening up until then was basically that OpenAI was based on donations that weren't about profit, and Musk himself gave a huge amount to support OpenAI. But then it started collaborating with Microsoft on its pre-AGI technology. Highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. As I mentioned, this is the term that has been adopted largely for the definition of AI itself. But then GPT-4 came along, and it became clear that it was close to, if not better than the average human at reasoning. It scored in the 90th percentile on the uniform bar exam for lawyers. It scored in the 99th percentile on the GRE verbal assessment. It even scored 77% on the advanced sommelier examination. Sommelier is a wine expert, and how GPT can judge wines is beyond me, but it is. And most importantly, people were beginning to acknowledge that GPT-4 was already an AGI algorithm. GPT-4 is an AGI algorithm. What I'm reading out here is from the lawsuit that that Elon Musk launched against Sam Altman, OpenAI, and Brockman too, basically it's like a history in some ways of AI. The lawsuit is astonishing, and even Microsoft's own researchers, as it puts it, have publicly stated, given the breadth and depth of GPT-4's capabilities, we believe that it could reasonably be viewed as an early, yet still incomplete version of an artificial general intelligence, AGI system. And you recall last week that Stuart Russell mentions this. There is a school of thought that says basically once the Wright brothers had developed a plane that could fly, that all other planes effectively had learned were based on that principle, and that was the beginning of flight. Stuart Russell doesn't agree with that, but that's certainly the view of Blaise Aguirre-Arcos. He believes that that AGI, early forms of AGI, are already here, and we'll hear from him in a few weeks' time, a couple of weeks' time. Now, what happened? Of course, the whole thing becomes a complete soap opera. Sam Altman fired back at Elon Musk's criticism of OpenAI, saying, "I like the dude, but that he's totally wrong about this stuff." And then, curiously, Musk drops the lawsuit without explaining why. He just drops the lawsuit. But then, even more curiously, he sues them again, alleging deceit of Shakespearean proportions. I won't get into all this, but clearly this is part of the ongoing soap opera. Then there was a story about Sam Altman being fired from OpenAI, and this itself is totally connected with the story of AGI. This is part of the lawsuit again on information and belief. Mr. Altman's firing was due in part to OpenAI's breakthrough in realizing AGI. In fact, news reports suggested there was a rift among OpenAI board members and executives regarding safety concerns and the potential threat posed by OpenAI's next generation Q-Star. Well, it was rumored very heavily at the time that this guy, Ilya Sutskever, was the one who was behind this. Sutskever, you'll recall, was part of Geoffrey Hinton's team at the ImageNet competition, and he was the one who was most concerned about the lack of concern for safety, that they were charging ahead with this with no constraint. It was a bit like a runaway train without any brakes. Then, of course, what happens? Things change completely in OpenAI. The soap opera continues. Sam Altman gets reinstated back as the CEO. And what happens then? Well, Sutskever, the one who had caused this attempted coup, as it were, is forced to leave. Scientists who said neural networks may already be conscious leaves OpenAI after leading coup against Sam Altman. And what does he do? He sets up a safe superintelligent company, SSI, with two colleagues from Israel, and is part of the opposition, but he's trying to produce a safe AGI, having given up on OpenAI because they are not paying enough attention to safety concerns. They're not paying enough attention to the so-called alignment problem of making sure that AI is aligned with human values. And once Sutskever's left, then OpenAI dissolves its safety team, not surprisingly. But then there's yet more drama at OpenAI, complete chaos going on at the same time. And more recently still, there's been a kind of slew of some of these extraordinarily talented people at OpenAI leaving OpenAI and going to work for their rivals. If OpenAI is right on the verge of AGI, why do prominent people keep leaving? Good question. Now, just as an aside, I think the Black Mirror episode needs to be brought in as an example. And I think that it's fair to say that that we will be threatened by the capabilities of AI. It's not that AI is evil. It's just a tool like any other tool. It depends on who uses it and for what. But it's just an astonishingly capable tool. I could use a kitchen knife to cut up vegetables or to murder you. Don't blame the tool. A bad theorist blames the tool. But what's become clear is that it's so capable, it's putting white-collar jobs at risk. Now, initially, we all thought that it was going to be the blue-collar workers, the factory workers whose jobs would be at risk, because we've seen these images of a Tesla factory with no human being in sight. But actually, when you take a robotic arm out of the very controlled environment of that factory, it will struggle. If you gave a robotic arm to the challenge of putting together stacking together a Lego brick wall, it would struggle to do it with the kind of motility, let's say, of a 2-year-old kid. Meanwhile, AI is racing ahead, and it's proving capable of not only translating languages and all these things, but writing code. In other words, what we're discovering, it is white-collar workers who are at threat. It is the lawyers, the engineers, the architects, and even the computer scientists who are at threat. Now, there's another myth out there that's basically, you will hear this over and over again, the idea that AI won't replace humans, but those using AI will replace those not using AI. This is Elon Musk again, saying that we're all basically cyborgs. We are all cyborgs. You have a machine extension of yourself in the form of your phone and your computer and all your applications. You are already superhuman. It is as a prosthesis that to human abilities that AI is most effective. And this is possibly the most important slide that I'm going to show you today, a very crude slide, very, very crude slide of some research that was done by some serious academic sociologists at MIT and Harvard, where they were testing out ChatGPT and discovering that it enhanced the capacity in terms of production, not only in terms of quality, but also in terms of quantity and speed of production. This is actually for quality, but the same principles apply for the other ones too. And what you can see is that the blue mountain, those not using AI, are the use of AI makes a huge difference. It looks like here, roughly almost 50% difference. And we can't afford not to use AI. We have to use AI just as we have to use spell check, we have to use calculators. It is an extraordinarily useful tool and that we need to be aware of. Now, this is the comment that you must have heard over and over again. And it troubles me deeply that people are still recanting this absurd comment. And it's absurd. Well, in some ways, it's true. AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace those without AI. But it is misleading because it assumes it's a kind of one-for-one correlation. It assumes that one person using AI will replace one person not using AI. But going back to this, we can see that one person using AI can achieve so much more than one person not using AI. In other words, we will see offices shrinking. We will see architectural offices shrinking, all sorts of offices shrinking, because we can achieve so much more with AI. The real equation is something like this. AI won't replace humans, but 3 humans with AI will replace 5 humans without AI. Now, one of the most disturbing aspects of this, as many have pointed out, is the fact that it's learned how that these GPT models have learned how to train themselves to write code, to translate languages, and this itself is a source of concern itself. So Yuval Harari, maybe I should have put him in the cast of characters. I should have done. Yuval Harari says that basically what AI has achieved, and this was some time back, back in 2023, that AI has hacked the operating system of human civilization. AI has hacked the operating system of human civilization. It's learned how to write. And once you can write, you have enormous power because you can persuade people to do things. Now, I would claim that not only is it learnt to write, it's also learnt how to design. And forgive me for going back into the field of architecture briefly, but let me just point out that those of you who use Midjourney are only too aware that the prompts that you write often have a lot of information about lighting conditions, the quality of the hyper-realistic detail, the rendering package used, and so on. All this information. But in fact, well, certainly in my prompts, I might use 70 words to describe all that, but only very few words to describe the architecture. In this particular prompt, the only words I used to describe this building were ultra-contemporary minimalist building, or villa, I think it was, ultra-contemporary minimalist villa in the Austrian Alps. I didn't tell it what those Alps in the background would look like, what this boulder in the foreground would look like. I didn't tell it anything about what this building would look like, what materials it would be constructed out of. I didn't say anything like that. Basically, Midjourney designed the whole thing. Midjourney designed the whole thing based on a prompt where the references to architecture were limited to minimalist, ultra-contemporary villa in the Austrian Alps. Midjourney has learned how to design. Oh, this one, ultra-contemporary kitchen, stainless steel kitchen. I didn't mention anything about this painting in the background, this kind of nice painting, or the bushes outside, or whatever these things are, or this coffee maker here, or anything. Midjourney designed it all. Or this image. I don't know how long it would take to render an image like that, but Midjourney did it in 3 seconds, and that itself is pretty scary. Now, if we think that that's scary, then this is the next thing that is going to be very significant. OpenAI's Sora. They haven't released it yet. Supposedly they were going to release it in September. That's looking a little unlikely, but it should be out fairly soon. Now, we've had text-to-video text-to-video platforms since late 2022, but nothing remotely like this. This is next level. This is a complete revolution. The kind of quality of the details. Look at that detail in that image, and this clip. And the fact that it can maintain consistency for 60 seconds. And this is the crucial issue with text-to-video, is how long you can maintain consistency. And 60 seconds is truly astonishing. But what's more, it's shown itself capable of also developing emergent capabilities or emergent abilities. For example, there's a concept called occlusion. An occlusion refers to when something disappears out of the frame and comes back into it. And it's very, very difficult to achieve occlusion. And Sora has not been trained in it. But just watch this. All of a sudden, we lose sight of the suburban Tokyo in the background, boom, and it comes back. This is an example of occlusion. Sora has not been trained to do occlusion, and yet it's very capable of doing it. Or look at this one. The grasp of 3D is astonishing. Now, this, I think it's a moorhen from Papua New Guinea, anyway, whatever it is, I don't know, but it's the quality of the resolution is astonishing. But when this bird turns its head, you begin to really grasp the understanding of 3D that it's got. Truly astonishing. I was talking about this in Manchester, where maybe I shouldn't say where, but where a colleague had been working on Sora, and he wasn't able to tell me anything. But I could kind of glean from what he was saying that essentially we're getting very close to 3D. The sheer quantity of data on which things have been trained means that through photogrammetry, you can pretty much get towards 3D. You're very close to 3D. And architects would say, well, okay, but they can't do buildings. It's only architects can do that. Well, not so. This is Sora doing some interior design, and as you can see, pretty capable. Not maybe at such a kind of progressive design, but nonetheless, what we're seeing is pretty astonishing. Sora, when it comes onto the market, is clearly going to have a huge impact in the world of design. But actually, we can already do this ourselves in some senses. Well, though we don't have Sora, we do have other platforms, including Runway Generation 3. And the problem, of course, of Runway Generation 3, it's nowhere near as good as Sora. It can't do 60 seconds worth. In fact, it struggles to do 10 seconds worth of consistent video. But you can edit these things. You can divide them into short clips, and then you can upload them on Instagram with some music behind it that is synced using AI. And what you get is a kind of collage effect of video of clips that can be pretty convincing. And let me just show you a couple of my examples of what I've done using Runway Gen 3. And what is interesting is that something that's basically been produced to make a video can be used to make an architectural design. So here we go. So the first one I showed you was a video of art galleries in Venice, and this is an interior of an art gallery actually in Paris. It doesn't matter where, but you can see what these tools can do, and it's pretty astonishing. But you could also do other things, and let me just show you a very brief clip of what I was doing with fashion shows. I thought that fashion shows are very tame. What if we were to make a feral catwalk where the models were turning into werewolves and wolves, and it was a very different type of catwalk. And of course, you're getting them with certain outfits. So let's move on to the next one. This is the music of The Who behind this one. The particular piece is called Wolf Totem. Here we go. I firmly believe this is going to open up a new way of thinking about architecture in a kind of choreographed cinematographic manner. So I'm getting towards the end now. My apologies for taking so long. I think one of the key things, in terms of this kind of Black Mirror thing, is that we have failed to appreciate how potentially superior AI might be to human beings. Now, there have been a number of discussions about comparing AI to human intelligence, to natural intelligence. For example, Ray Kurzweil has a lot about this, but in some senses, that approach is not nuanced enough. You need to have a much more nuanced approach that doesn't just talk about intelligence as a whole, but talks about the different cognitive skills that make up intelligence. So we already know that ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more than any human being. ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more than any human being. But that doesn't mean very much if you don't understand what you know. So the next step is to be able to develop some sense of understanding. And then you get towards some kind of thinking, some form of thinking of some kind. And eventually you start reasoning. And once you can start reasoning and getting increasingly developed in your reasoning, so the commentators say we develop consciousness. I don't know if we need to develop consciousness. That's another question. But there are different steps. So let's hear Geoffrey Hinton, who has a background in neuroscience because he was interested in the brain before he was interested in AI, and he's basically an expert in both fields. What does he have to say about how AI compares to human natural intelligence? And just to point out, he was both working at the University of Toronto, from which he's now a professor emeritus, and he was also working for Google, and he stepped out of Google in order to express his concerns because he was worried that this tool that he'd been instrumental in promoting, he is, after all, the godfather of certainly of deep learning, if not AI as a whole, was actually performing way better than he thought, and he was getting concerned. So this is Geoffrey Hinton giving us a bit of Black Mirror episode.
It made me realize that these digital intelligences have something we don't have that makes them much better. When one of them knows something, it can tell all the others. That's what we don't have with people. So imagine you had 10,000 people, and imagine if when one person learned something, everybody knew it. You could learn a lot more stuff, right?
Right.
And that's why things like ChatGPT knows like 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's because when you train it, there's lots of different copies looking at different bits of the data and learning stuff, and they can all combine what they learn instantly with a bandwidth of like trillions of bits.
So can they think?
Yes. So imagine the following scenario. I'm talking to chatbot, and we talk for a bit, and the answers it's given me seem a bit strange to me, and I suddenly realize that it thinks I'm a teenage girl. And I say, what demographic do you think I am? And it says it thinks I'm a teenage girl. So the question is, when I said I suddenly realized it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was that a metaphorical use of the word think, or was that just the same way as we use think? And I strongly believe that use of the word think, when I said it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was exactly the same way of using think as we do with people.
And so that was enough to make you say, what, this has accelerated beyond my comfort level?
I suddenly realized maybe they already are better, and making them more like real neural nets isn't the point. They're already better than us. They're a better way of doing learning. And if we make them bigger, they'll get much smarter than us. They already know more than any one person.
I understand that things could go awry, but I still think that people hear the notion of danger and they dismiss it as hyperbole.
I thought it was hyperbole for a long time because I thought these things were a long way off. I thought there will eventually be danger, but I thought focusing on it now is unnecessary because it'll be 30 to 50 years before these things get more intelligent than us. But this combination of realizing that they might have a much better way of learning than we have, because they can share knowledge instantly, and seeing things like ChatGPT or Palm at Google that can explain why a joke is funny, made me realize these things are already pretty intelligent, and if they've got a better form of intelligence than ours, then it gets to be much more urgent.
So just to kind of comment on this, I mean, Geoffrey Hinton had long thought that the litmus test of understanding was whether AI could understand a joke. And he asked Palm to explain a joke, and it explained it very well. His point is this: if it can explain the joke, it must understand the joke. There are others out there also, including Blaise Aguirre-Arcos, who think that basically ChatGPT understands the questions. That's why it gives us such good answers. And this is also something Geoffrey Hinton thinks. It is developing some form of understanding, and a context-based understanding, more to the point, because all the data is embedded in a particular context. Now, he goes on to say that it can think. Now, I personally, I agree with Geoffrey Hinton on everything, apart from the fact that I would want to use inverted commas for thinking. In fact, I want to use inverted commas for everything, for learning, for intelligence, for thinking, everything that it's doing, because it's not quite the same as humans, I don't think. Anyway, he goes on to say, not here but elsewhere, that that he thinks that AI has got the capacity to, it's really got a very different form of intelligence. It's got a very different form of intelligence. It's a mechanical intelligence and not a biological, natural intelligence. It's a very different form of intelligence, but nonetheless, he thinks that it is infinitely superior, potentially, to human intelligence. And this is something that we're hearing a refrain from everyone around. It is infinitely superior, potentially infinitely superior. Now, the issue he's talking about here is that it can share its information. You can train these models because of the transformer architecture that transformed everything. You can train them on this huge amount of data, and they're able to share information. Now, up until now, the dominant model of exponential growth in AI has been Moore's law. Gordon Moore had observed back in the 60s that with a circuit board, the number of transistors in a circuit board would double every 18 months, and the price would come down by half. This was exponential growth. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, we get 1, 2, 4, 8 exponential growth. But what Geoffrey Hinton's talking about here is something truly astonishing, not connected to circuit boards or the market or anything, but the way they can learn, it can share information with 1,000 others. Think of COVID. In the UK, when we had COVID, we had a thing called the R number. If it was less than 1, it was good news. It was going down. If it was more than 1, it was bad news. It was going up. Well, what if the R number were 1,000? This is truly significant, I believe. If you're terrified by that, then Yuval Harari will make you even more terrified. I've got 2 clips of his, and then this will just to give you a sense of the Black Mirror side of things.
This is the end of human history, the end of human-dominated history. History will continue with somebody else in control. In 5 years, there'll be a technology that can make decisions independently and that can create new ideas independently. Maybe they'll be nice. Maybe they'll solve cancer and climate change, but we are not sure. I'm tending to think of it more in terms of really an alien invasion. An alien fleet of spaceships coming from planet Zircon or whatever, with highly intelligent beings. This is what we are facing, except that the aliens are not coming in spaceships from planet Zircon, they're coming from the laboratory. If the humans are divided among themselves and are in an arms race, then it becomes almost impossible to contain this alien intelligence.
So the term alien intelligence, the title of this particular lecture, is something that many are referring to these days. And I think it's particularly a useful term because it prevents us from anthropomorphizing the term intelligence. It prevents us from anthropomorphizing the term intelligence. It makes it sound radically other. It is radically other, completely different. I use the term alien intelligence, and I've used it for some time now for this reason. My only suspicion of the work of Harari is that he kind of locks into the other side of alien intelligence, or the other side of alien, the suspicion of the alien that we saw, for example, in HAL 9000 in 2001: A Space Odyssey, that somehow we should be suspicious of computers, of AI, of monoliths or whatever. I would question whether that's not taken to an extreme degree. What about a sympathetic, empathetic relationship between humans and AI? I was walking on the beach the other day and I saw this woman with her dog, and clearly there was an incredible sense of empathy between the woman and her dog. Why would this not be the case with AI? Why must we necessarily think of this as a threat? And the way he talks about the humans being divided among themselves, it's almost like we, the human race as a whole, need to protect ourselves from that other form of alien intelligence. Having said that, he's got a point on some things. Let me play you maybe his most recent disturbing comments.
There was an experiment when OpenAI developed GPT-4, like 2 years ago. They wanted to test what can this thing do. So they gave it a task to solve CAPTCHA puzzles. The CAPTCHA puzzles, like when you go online and you want to access your bank or whatever, and they have this riddle that you have to solve, an image that you have to say what are the twisted words and then letters to make sure you are not a robot. GPT-4 could not solve the CAPTCHA. But what GPT-4 did, it accessed TaskRabbit, which is an online site where you can hire humans to do different things for you. And it asked a human to solve the CAPTCHA for it. Now, the human got suspicious.
The human asked, why do you need somebody to solve CAPTCHA for you? Are you a robot? It asked directly, are you a robot? And GPT-4 answered, no, I'm not a robot. I have a vision impairment, which is why I can't solve the CAPTCHA, so I need your help.
That's when it gets scary. So, thinking that we are superior to AI, and we continually do this. What I want to argue is that we need to revise our outlook. We have adopted a predominantly anthropocentric outlook, looking down on AI. AI is not sentient, it's not self-aware, it's got no consciousness. Clearly, it's inferior. Well, what would AI think of us if it could think? You know, whereas human beings know 10,000 times less information than ChatGPT. We are incredibly slow. So if Morgadet's correct in predicting that AI will have an IQ of 1,500 in a few years' time, and that we will be to AI roughly what a 2-year-old kid is to Einstein. If that's correct, what's going to happen in the future is AI is going to be running rings around us. In some ways, it's going to be running rings around us just in that CAPTCHA story. I therefore, in my talks, I call for what I term a second Copernican revolution. Just as Nicholas Copernicus had pointed out that the Earth is not the center of the universe, rather the Earth orbits around the sun, so too we need to understand that we are not the center of intelligence in the universe. We need to acknowledge that. We need to get off our anthropocentric pedestal and understand things as they truly are. This is Elon Musk again, talking about how biological intelligence is on the way out. So here we are, Musk.
I mean, AI might be the most important question of all. The percentage of intelligence that is biological, grows smaller with each passing month. Eventually, the percentage of intelligence that is biological will be less than 1%. That's actually not what, we just, I guess, don't want AI that is brittle. If the AI is somehow brittle, silicon circuit boards don't do well just out in the elements. So I think biological intelligence can serve as a backstop, as a buffer of intelligence. But almost all, as a percentage, almost all intelligence will be digital. So then it's like, well, what role will there be for us? I don't know. I think it's very important that we build the AI in a way that is beneficial to humanity. And there's some important principles here, because I've thought about AI safety for a very long time. I think you want to have a maximum truth-seeking AI. This is very important. The AI should not be taught to lie. It should not be taught to say things that are not true. even if those things are politically incorrect, it should still say say what it believes to be true. I mean, the entire plot of 2001: Space Odyssey, the reason that HAL 9000 killed the astronauts was because it was forced to lie. I don't know if most people realize that. That's what Arthur C. Clarke was trying to say. Don't make the AI lie. The AI was told that the astronauts could not know the secret of the monolith, but also that it must take them to the monolith. The solution, take them to the monolith dead. So it's very important to have a maximum truth-seeking AI and a maximally curious AI. And I think that's most likely to foster human civilization, because we are much more interesting than a bunch of rocks.
So, I mean, is he correct? I mean, we just heard this story about GPT-4 lying in order to get through the capture test. No, I'm not a robot. But what I'm showing this to you for is to say that this is Elon Musk. This is one of the key players in the world right now, one of the most wealthy, if not the wealthiest man around, and somebody also who is deeply involved in AI. Now, what he's basically saying here is that his thinking is conditioned by science fiction. 2001: Space Odyssey, the very movie that we start off with, is behind his way of thinking. In other words, it's not simply that we're in some kind of soap opera or Black Mirror episode or something else. Rather, my point is that the leading thinkers are actually being conditioned by science fiction. Isn't that amazing? Let's hear from Arthur C. Clarke. He's the guy, we haven't seen him yet, behind all this. This is astonishing. This is Arthur C. Clarke talking in 1963, 60 years ago, about the future and getting it spot on, as though he's saying exactly the same things as Geoffrey Hinton. Human beings, in biological intelligence, will give way to a mechanical intelligence. But importantly, he doesn't panic about this. Okay, here we go.
For the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. Now, the present-day electronic brains are complete morons, but this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't see why it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal men, and we presume we're an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we are now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
So, don't panic. Here we are in La La Land. I want to refer to another movie, a kind of parallel movie, shall we say, to 2001: A Space Odyssey. Also, a Brit involved in writing this. First of all, it was a radio series, then it became a book, then it became a TV series, then it became a series of movies. Now, unlike 2001, this is very jokey in some sense, but it does engage with AI, and it does engage with many philosophical questions that 2001: A Space Odyssey does, but from a very different point of view. Those of you who've seen the movie will probably remember there is a massive supercomputer called Deep Thought that is behind all this, and it's given the task of coming up with the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Life, the universe, and everything. And it takes 7.5 million years to come up with the answer. And as many of you know, the answer's 42, which of course perplexes everyone. And then Deep Thought comments, well, it would have been good if you had maybe posed the question in the right way. Now, then it goes on. Then there's another computer that is produced, which actually happens to be the Earth, and the Earth has 10 million years to come up with the answer to what is the question to the ultimate answer of life, the universe, and everything. Unfortunately, just as the Earth is about to come up with the answer, it is destroyed by the Vogons, who want to clear a path for an ultra kind of for us an intergalactic superhighway. So we never get to see that. But the point is this: Elon Musk thinks that this is one of the most important books ever written, and it is a book about philosophy. In order to get the right answer, you have to ask the right question. As an engineer, he knows that. Tom Main, as an architect, makes similar comments. In order to get the best project, you have to ask the right questions in the first step. What is the challenge? What is the problem that you are addressing? Anyway, as you all know, on the back cover of that book are these words: don't panic, don't panic. Perhaps you've not noticed, though, that when Elon Musk sent his Tesla car into outer space, it has the words "don't panic" written on the dashboard. Don't panic, because this was such an important book for Elon Musk. Elon Musk, basically one of the world's leading AI experts, one of the world's most wealthy and influential people, is basing his entire philosophy on science fiction. Science fiction. Isn't that astonishing? And of course, you'll say, but it's only 2 movies. You've just showed us 2001. He quoted from that, and he quoted from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. What about Blade Runner? What about Blade Runner? This is the car from Blade Runner, the first version, produced in 1982, designed by Sid Mead. And what is interesting is this formed the basis of the Tesla Cybertruck. What's more, the Tesla Cybertruck was launched on November, I think it was the 19th or 21st or whatever it was, of November 2019. And that, we understand, was the date, or were the dates in which the Blade Runner movie was set. 19th, 21st of November 2019. Remarkable. Let me just put to you 2 other comments about this. What happened on November the 18th, 2019? Well, it was when COVID was discovered initially in China. The parallels between the replicants, this almost difficult to detect because they look so similar to humans, and therefore you have to have an elaborate test to find out, the Vogt-Kampff test, whether they are humans or not, and COVID are interesting. Both required tests, and both replicants and COVID are potentially lethal. But let me leave you with a final thought in terms of Blade Runner. The person who develops the replicants, the head of the Tyrell Corporation, is called Eldon Tyrell. It is a future world dominated by tech industries. Take the name Eldon, remove the D, and what do you have? Elon. However, now I'm going to wrap up now. My apologies for taking so long. I don't think we need to worry. I would say that the future is going to be completely different to the present. There won't be so many jobs. Offices will shrink. But there'll be huge benefits in terms of science and technologies. But my point is, we human beings are infinitely adaptive creatures. We adapt. We adapt. And indeed, we can't even remember what it's like in a previous age. We can't even remember how we managed to do things before we had facial recognition on our phones, or indeed before we had phones in the first place, the iPhone. When did that happen? And what on earth how do we navigate a city without a smartphone? How do we do that? We've completely forgotten about this. Let me go back to Arthur C. Clarke, who is such an astonishing font of wisdom, the collaborator with Stanley Kubrick on 2001: Space Odyssey, talking about adaptation and why humans adapt.
And yet, you know, human beings are almost infinitely adaptable. Look at the incredible changes we've experienced and survived from the Stone Age to the present time. And yet even greater changes are still to come, because the future is not merely an extension of the present with bigger and better machines and cities and gadgets. It will be fundamentally different, and many of the things we take for granted will one day pass away as completely as spinning wheels and sedan chairs and oil lamps. And that is why the future is so endlessly fascinating, because try as we can, we'll never outguess it.
So I want to leave you with one particular thought. We are infinitely adaptive creatures. We adapt to everything. Let me give you one example. If 50 years ago, somebody had said to me, when I was a young kid, said to me, in 50 years' time, most marriages will end in divorce. Most marriages will end in divorce. I would have thought, oh my God, it's the end of the civilization, end of the world. What's going to happen? Most marriages ending in divorce. Well, certainly in the States, if not necessarily in other countries, most marriages do end in divorce. And we are quite okay with it. This is our new normal. The future will be different. There will be less jobs. Offices will shrink. Architectural offices will shrink. The world will be different. It'll be more convenient in some ways. We will have forgotten about the past, the world of today, and that will be our new normal because we're able to adjust. Let me finish then in a very British way. We should not panic. Keep calm and carry on. Thank you. So I'm sorry that took so long, but hopefully there was a lot of information in there. And I think we have some time for some questions. I don't know if there are going to be any questions. Normally there are, but let me unshare my screen and see. Yeah. Okay, let me just have a look and see some of these questions.
There are some questions on the chat on YouTube as well.
Okay.
But also here on Zoom.
Okay, so we've got Vasco, who always asks great questions. Vasco, are you able to, is it noise in the background or?
Yeah, noise in the background.
Okay, let me read this out. Great to see you, Vasco. How do you envision AGI impacting the education and training of architects? Should the curriculum evolve to focus on how to work alongside AGI systems, or should human architects be encouraged to focus on uniquely human skills that AGI might replicate? What a fantastic question. How do you envision AGI impacting the education and training of architects? Should the curriculum evolve to focus on how to work alongside AGI systems, or should human architects be encouraged to focus on uniquely human skills? So, I mean, this is the kind of I was going to say $6 million question, but now we're in the world of billions. It's $6 billion question. You know, I think education, and actually I'm in the process of I'm working on a book with Reti and Joseph Choma on this question. Education really is the crucial thing. I mean, for many different reasons. First of all, we are those of us who are teaching, and Vasco is a professor in Bangladesh, those of us who are teaching, we're sending kids out into a world that is going to be fundamentally different. That itself is there's an imperative for us to really adapt and to that world and be preparing the kids for that world. And unfortunately, I would say, and I've had experience of teaching with some fairly conservative places over the years, unfortunately, education is very ill-equipped to deal with that, partly because the structure of how we operate. I mean, if you're in an office, you're forced to adapt. If you're working foster and partners or whatever, you are forced to adapt to every new technology and to get up to steam on it. Whereas education is not. And the real danger of education, it's kind of adrift, marooned in some kind of hyperspace, unconnected to the world of kind of reality, if we call it that. So there are stories about professors, and the favorite story I had that Joseph Brickbat told me about once. He said there was once a professor who was very popular when he first started and was packing out the auditoria, and then when he towards his retirement, there was only about 6 people in the front row, and he said, "What's happened? I'm teaching exactly the same material as I used to. Why are there so many people there?" That's perhaps the problem. I mentioned this story before. You might have heard it before, but I think the key question ultimately is how do we operate that? I mean, of course, there are challenges for education. First of all, if we don't need so many architects, we won't need so many students. Let's say we only have half the number of students. Also, if AI is doing all the work for us, maybe we don't need to have 5 years to study architecture. It could be 3 years. Put that together, and we'll need 30% of the professors in the future. But let's go beyond that. I mean, I think the real challenge, and this is something we've debated on Digital Futures before, is the fact that actually the way we operate has got to change completely. We are no longer the people who just, regurgitate knowledge, and that's our job. Because there's more knowledge out there on YouTube. Sanjay Sama, who's head of open learning at MIT, gave us a talk about this. There is more information on YouTube, and we have to be what Alethi Mokopoulou calls curiosity stimulators, sort of basically pointing our students in the right direction, because we can't have to do that. But of course, the real challenge, and I was talking about this, I think yesterday, it was on our tutorial, is the fact that there are so few people in the world who really know what is going on. And that's what we're trying to do on our Saturday session tutorials, is bringing together some of those experts and getting them to teach, because that's the only way you can operate as with a doctoral consortium or a kind of single platform to share this knowledge, because not only MIT, I think, could keep up with what's going on. But I think there is other kind of issues that I think are appearing. What I would claim is that what certainly working with Midjourney, you still have to be a good designer. You still have to be a good designer, because you cannot improve unless you can select the right item and iterate and iterate. You've still got to know what good design is. You've got to have a good eye. You've got to know what is good. And therefore, I think that in the future, at the same time, the technology is getting easier to use. Then that's a general shift, I think, in terms of iPhones. As soon as you could start to swipe and things are getting easier on the whole. Grasshopper is easier than scripting we were doing in DDes all those years ago, and so on and so on. So you still have to have a good eye, and I think that's going to be the shift that's going to be there. We're going to be above all curators. We're not sort of not designers in the old-fashioned sense. We're going to be controlling systems. They're going to be generating outputs. We're not going to be designing. We're going to be generating, and they're going to be outputs rather than designs. And we have to be able to find a way of handling this. So I think the whole way in which you operate is going to be fundamentally different. And we're going through a kind of paradigm shift. And I think we also need to therefore develop a form of a new lexicon to deal with that, where we're not talking about designing a design. We're generating an outcome, and we're using this tool as a prosthesis that is enhancing what we're not very good at. And I mentioned this the other day, and someone objected to it, but I don't think we're very good. I don't think our imagination is very good. I think we're very good at selecting things. You smell a cocktail, or you sip a cocktail, or taste you sip a cocktail or smell a perfume. Immediately, you know if you like it or not. We're very good at that. We're very good discriminators, but we're not so good at generating. So it's going to enhance the way we operate. It's going to change us. We're going to become curators. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think going back to 2001: A Space, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you have to ask the right questions to get the right answer. And I think your questions are always spot on, Vasco. We have to ask those questions because the world is changing. So I think it's an ongoing debate. And my apologies, I've mentioned this before, because I talk all over the place and I never know what I've said on one particular platform. But yeah, I totally, think that. So we've got another question in the in the chat from John E5. It's possible to make form, but where is the narrative behind the form? Still very shallow in how this is used, but there are designers out there doing interesting things with design and social narratives. This is actually the crucial question in some senses. What is the meaning behind things? AI has no sense of meaning whatsoever. And I think the way that we add meaning to things, we make sense of things. There's a story. Hayden White is a philosopher of science. Sorry, a theorist of history, I should say, a kind of post-structuralist theorist of history. And what Hayden White would say is that there's a difference between, let's say, a chronicle, a series of events that happen, and what history proper is actually adding to that. It's basically making sense of it. So if you've got a series of events, and the example I often give is like Columbus, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Columbus comes to America. 1493, Columbus has a McDonald's. 1494, Columbus dies of food poisoning. Now, how do we make sense of that? I mean, an obvious strategy perhaps would be to say that Columbus got food poisoning by eating McDonald's. But what is interesting is the problem about the meaning that is smuggled into that. In other words, you're smuggling in your own interpretation and claiming that is what happened. So that's the problem in some sense of history, of adding narrative to things. It's helpful to make sense of things, but then how does it change things? I actually think, AI is a world without meaning, zero meaning, but we are meaning-making machines. We're constantly looking for meaning in everything. And as Katie Lloyd-Thomas, one of my former students at Nottingham, used to say, the quest for meaning begets meaning. In other words, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I personally think that logic of looking for meaning is what leads to religion and trying to find meaning in the universe and so on. But what if the universe is simply kind of chaotic Brownian motion of just things that are happening? If there's no meaning in the universe, it's simply an expression of something. Is there meaning behind a volcano, or is a volcano simply an eruption that is caused by scientific principles? So I'm at the same time, meaning is kind of useful, but then how useful is it? Anyway, it's a good question. There are two sides of the argument. Okay, maybe I could just, Gustavo's got some questions he's recorded, I think from YouTube. Are you proposing that architecture broaden its reach from design to computation to speculative designers of narrative through semantic view? What do you propose for design education, a mixture of language and logic? Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, of course, this is a strategy that's been used, world building. Alex McDowell, who's been part of USC's School of Cinematic Arts, has a whole project called World Building, and a lot of the movies that we know that he was involved in were actually coming out of that world building tradition. And that can be a productive strategy for coming up with a solution, a speculative solution, and speculative everything. I'm just remember the names of these two guys from New York, a British guy and a German woman. Anyway, there is, I'm blanking on the names, but there is an approach to that is a strategy for designing. Sputniko, who was at MIT Media Lab, was someone who would use that in her own work and so on. It doesn't have to be that way, I don't think. But I guess what I'm saying, I mean, I guess the message in this lecture is kind of, well, we've got this guy Elon Musk. He's highly influenced by the science fiction books that he wrote. And even though he's dealing with the concrete realities of life, that world of science fiction has a powerful impact on his way of thinking, surprisingly. But I think in order to make sense of things, we have these movies, we create these things, and I think that's probably the way to understand the whole soap opera of AGI, is to make it into a movie to make sense of it. But I haven't really answered that question. But let me just look at the other question. How about embodied knowledge in experimenting with data and explorations of different spatial paradigms? It seems to me that the challenge of the future for architects to move closer to the edges and domain specialization of the sciences and a poetic understanding of the arts. World building Minority Report. Oh, that must be the part of the same question. Of course, Minority Report was the movie in which Alex McDowell was involved. Embodied knowledge is, okay. What I find interesting is that no, I'm blanking on his name. There was a guy from Chile, a neuroscientist, who would always talk about how everything has to be embodied and our understanding of the world has to be embodied. It'll come back to me probably too late. What is interesting is that Blaise Aguirre-Arcos is arguing, and he'll no doubt talk about this in 2 weeks' time, that in fact, the way that some of these AI models are being trained is in fact on contextualized knowledge, not necessarily embodied knowledge, but contextualized knowledge. In other words, if you use Midjourney and you refer to, I'm blanking on the name of the Mexican architect who does beautiful colors. Anyway, Louis Barragan. If you put Louis Barragan's name into the prompt, it will contextualize Louis Barragan. You'll get not just Louis Barragan colors or forms, you'll also get Mexican landscapes, Mexican fauna, Mexican lighting conditions, and so on. So in some senses, we are already kind of embodied or contextualized in that way. And that's why Blaise kind of thinks that we're getting towards an AI with understanding. Of course, this is how human beings work. We also have a kind of contextualized understanding of the world where things are associative. So if you go into a kitchen and there's a red hob on the top of on the cooker, you know not to touch it because you know it's going to be hot through memories and associations of the past. So I don't know to what extent embodied knowledge is that important. And of course, what is interesting is how you can simulate embodied knowledge or simulate certain aspects, certainly of the emotions and so on. And this is the work I think that Behnaz Farahi, for example, is working on now at MIT Media Lab. You can simulate things, and this is the case that where it gets a little dangerous because AI can simulate that, and we know from the movie Her that it can simulate relationships. And some of my students at FIU were last year. There were a lot of them saying, "Oh, yeah, but AI hasn't got no empathy. It's no good. It's not as good as human beings. It can't empathize with us." Well, it can simulate empathy, and the best presentation I got, I think, was saying that. He said, the problem is not that AI's got no empathy. The problem is AI can simulate empathy, and soon we're going to be in a Her situation whereby we're potentially going to have relationships with AI, and that's already happening in China, apparently, in Japan. There are already evidence of that. And of course, the danger there is that then you get robotic sex toys and things, and you lose interest in human beings because they don't say no, or God knows what else, and that's the problem. So I think that for me, the question is not a lack of empathy and things. It's more that it can simulate things. Okay, Jose from the DDes, this is the FIU Doctor of Design. I want to know your opinion about AI and creativity. I strongly think AI can be creative in the human sense of creativity, but the majority disagree with it. That's a can of worms, Jose. And I'm pretty controversial on that question. If we go back to the AlphaGo situation, comparing AlphaGo to Lisa Doll. And Lisa Doll says that basically moves that we thought were creative are actually pretty average compared with what AlphaGo could do. Well, was it being creative? Was it actually being creative? Was it, in fact, in some ways, it wasn't being creative at all. It was just simply following a set of procedures. It was coming up with an effective strategy. And you could take the view, well, but that's maybe what we should be doing, and we're not as good as AI at doing that. And we have this mysterious concept called creativity that actually was a very recent invention. I think it was the guy who wrote about affordances. I mean, it was only in 1929, I think. Was it Gibson? No, maybe it wasn't him. No, but it goes back to 1929. Maybe it was way before that. 1929, it was coined as a term. We didn't have that before. Now, this is where Arthur C. Clarke is really interesting. Arthur C. Clarke, I mean, I want to compare, I would just simply compare creativity to magic. Now, I don't think magic exists. There is no such thing as magic. All we do, all a conjurer does, and it's called a trick, right? A magic trick. All you do is conceal the operations at work. That you pull a rabbit out of a hat or something, and how did the rabbit get there? How did the rabbit get there? We don't know. It's all about a trick. It makes you think it's magic, but actually it's not. Arthur C. Clarke makes this comment: any sufficiently advanced technology resembles magic. That's interesting. But he also makes the comment that what is magic but something that science has yet to explain? At least that's attributed to him. And I think that's kind of important as such. So my question would be is there such thing as creativity, or is it just a convenient term that we use and it doesn't really exist? And that actually it's not so much whether AI is creative like humans, but whether or not humans are more like are actually uncreative like AI. I question that. I know it's a very provocative line to take, and I'm going to publish a chapter on this in a forthcoming book on AI. But at the same time, just to kind of maybe argue against myself, at the same time, we use the term. It's a manner of expression. We know it. We use the term magic. We might know that magic doesn't really exist. We still use the term magic, and we still use the term creativity, even though maybe creativity as such doesn't actually exist. So, but I think we should ask some provocative questions, and I think this is why AI is so interesting in many ways, is that it becomes a mirror in which to understand our very human operations. Now, you can never make direct comparisons between the brain and the neural network because we don't know what's going on in the brain yet. And although Yosha Bach says we do know what's going on in neural networks, I'm not sure we do fully yet, but maybe we do. But I don't think we know what's going on in either yet. They're both black boxes. We therefore can't really make any meaningful discussion. So anyway, do we have any other comments in the chat? Yeah, lots of comments coming in from Gustavo. I mean, do you want to say something, Gustavo, just as a to just?
Oh, Neil, no. I was actually posting. This is from YouTube. This AST Anarcho, and he's actually citing the part about the lying in ChatGPT. So that's why I wanted you to see his comments. They seem pretty interesting.
Okay. Let me just read it out because you won't see it on the Zoom chat. It says basically, Asto Anarcho's name: consciousness can't be created; it can only be accessed. Is extrapolating thinking. Brute force isn't everything. Intelligence isn't about humans; it's about problem solving. A cell has intelligence. Lying is a question of priorities if it's a part of the problem solving, thus absolutely legitimate. Soft landing, fiction creates memes. When memes become true, adapt or perish. AI can't create anything completely new yet. It only shuffles and mimics things. Well, I would totally disagree with that one. Otherwise, I agree with all these comments. Mimicking. I mean, if you're going to believe Mario Carpo, and please don't, because he talks nonsense, but Mario Carpo has an article called Imitation Games where he falls into the trap of saying that that AI mimics things, it copies things. Well, I did an exercise once in Midjourney based on Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, and I must have generated, I don't know, 10,000 output images. Not a single one was anything like the Barcelona Pavilion. Not a single one. Meanwhile, I wrote a book, and I don't want to go on about too much, called Camouflage, where I'm looking at the question of mimicry. And human beings copy the whole time. Let's be absolutely clear. Human beings copy the whole time. This is a comment by Adorno. The human only becomes human by copying other human beings. If someone's wearing a certain baseball cap, then someone else copies it, certain pair of Nike shoes. If someone's humming a tune or playing some music, then someone copies it. If someone's dressing in a certain way. These are memes. These are fashion things that we replicate, we copy, and that's how we ourselves operate. So I think we are, but very imperfectly. There's a kind of creative process to that. We don't necessarily copy directly anyway. But AI absolutely doesn't copy, and it can't copy, because in the case of the diffusion models, you disrupt something. You don't. You deliberately make it different. And in any case, you're just drawing upon features and nothing more than that. And that's the point about GANs, is that it picks up on features. It never copies. So there's a whole issue there about whether AI copies in the first place. And then the question of copyright is another one of these kind of challenging issues. But that's for another discussion. Yeah. Well, we're drawing to the end. I've been talking for way too long. My apologies. Do we have any final comments?
Well, Neil, I just wanted to say that one thing that caught me by surprise, but I've heard before, is that a lot of tech companies, especially in Silicon Valley, were inspired by cinema, and they were inspired by science fiction writing. How do you propose that architects take more control of imagination and actually forward thinking into the future? How do we take control of space, philosophy, creative narratives, language? What would be your, I would say, how would you create the ground for a new educational paradigm for the 21st century?
That's a big question. No, I think that I think it's really interesting that Elon Musk is quoting these movies, these science fiction movies, and they've been inspiring what he's been doing. No, it's not just that, because he's clearly somebody who is extremely smart and who's able to make things work. He's an engineer, and he's combining that not understanding of how to make things work with inspiration from these movies, where they're asking these questions. And what I find astonishing is the fact that Arthur C. Clarke is a science fiction writer, and yet he's got the future spot on. He's got the future. In fact, he describes also a kind of knowledge worker. He said in the future, we won't have to move anywhere. We can actually communicate from our living rooms. And I'm doing that right now. And many of you are doing that right now. We're doing that. In other words, place is not so important, or rather, maybe it is important, because if you can be anywhere, place becomes important. But he's describing a kind of a remote worker. And in fact, all my teaching at FIU is online, both on the Doctor of Design program, although you can study in person, and a few, well, it's challenging, but a few do. It's mainly online, and I'm teaching online, and also I'm teaching a course which is a theory of AI class, where I basically post these kind of TED Talks, where I'm giving mini lectures. And increasingly I'm thinking, well, why am I posting mine? Why don't I just go to give a TED Talk? Why don't I give, whatever, Blaise Aguriakos' TED Talk, or, and so on. And that's increasingly becoming the case. So I think we have to mutate and change and be inventive about how we operate in terms of design, of terms of teaching. what was the other point you were making, Gustavo? Sorry, I missed
No,
it.
no, you're writing a new book on technology. So how do you build the next generation, a new paradigm of education, if we're beholden to design studio? That's usually 90% of the curriculum in architecture school. So design, computation, algorithmic thinking. So should we shrink that number and go into science fiction, writing, philosophy, logic? How do you see education changing in the next decade or so?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to be you have to have a good eye. I mentioned this to Vasco. You have to have a good eye. So that I think we will be becoming increasingly connoisseurs of good taste. That sounds a bit pretentious or something, but basically we'll have to have good eye because AI will be. We have to have a good eye because AI will be throwing out all these options, and we need to be able to select the right one and go with it. I made a comment years ago in terms of computational design. You basically have to create a search field and unleash an algorithm, generate these outcomes, then find some way of selecting those outcomes. And it's a bit like the way that the photography's changed from the initial kind of with a tripod taking that ideal shot to how we operate today. We take a whole sample burst of photos, then select the right one, edit it, and play around with it, and filter it, and so on. I think that's the way it's shifting. So we still need to I think we need to train to be to have a good eye. And one of the questions we asked yesterday is, well, do you need to be so good at computation in the office of the future, or indeed the design studio of the future? And I would say there are two arguments to that. On the one hand, things are getting easier, so even people like myself can get by with Midjourney without having a great deal of technological expertise or indeed runway. At the same time, and that's the way it's been going. It's been going from coding to Grasshopper to whatever. It's easier and easier and easier. At the same time, you've got to have a few people. I'm thinking here of Daniel Bolojan, who's absolute genius. Daniel Bolojans of the world are there, and they can go under the hood, as it were, and bring out these things. And I think that's an important part of it. But one of the things you can't really predict is precisely how we're going to operate with these new technologies. And that's where I find people like Carlos Bagnon, who was on our tutorial Saturday before last, and where we get this in some ways, if you can use the term creativity, this is where it can come out, where you can develop a tool, but you don't know how people are going to use that tool. And this, I mentioned it before, is the problem with the iPhone, is that when it was developed, or the cell phone, when it was first developed, they thought it was going to be for rich businessmen. And of course, as history showed us, it was when the rich businessmen would give it to their daughters going out in the evening, and they'd say, give us a call when you want me to pick you up, and I'll come and pick you up. Then the social news changes and the thing exploded because it became more popular and cheaper, and then so on. So you can't predict the use. And that's going to be the interesting thing. And I think that's where people like Carlos Bagnon will be so significant, because they're going to inventively play with these tools and do some astonishing things. And we saw that yesterday also on our Digital Futures tutorial with the advanced session. Really amazing work that was being shown us. So yeah, I think the point is to recognize that things are going to change. There's a comment that Jean-François Lyotard made, who says we have to remain critical, but we have to remain critical within ever-changing circumstances. In other words, the world is changing, and the foundation on which we're operating is continually changing. So we have to adapt to that. We have to adapt to the new, but work critically. And that's, I think, is the challenge. How do you think yourself into a new scenario and adapt? It's so easy to fall back on what we're familiar with. And the typical example, the kind of Prince Charles example, is to say, well, look at these Beavis and Butthead kids of today. They can't spell, they can't add up, they can't even watch a movie from the beginning to end. But the point is, what can they do? They can develop new skills. And And I think that's the kind of issue, is not to fall back on what we know as being the case, but to be alive and adapted to the world that's evolving, and to find a critical, in other words, by critical, I mean one that benefits from the result of asking interesting questions and producing therefore good designs. That's the way forward. How do we adopt a critical approach that is in tune with our own age? And that's a challenge. That's a challenge.
Well, Neil, I just wanted to say thank you. I just wanted to read this quote from YouTube by Cyrus05W. I could do with 12 more hours of this. So thank you very much, Neil.
Well, we're having, I don't know how many more hours we're going to have, but come and do the DDes, Doctoral Design Program at FIU. We talk about this the whole time. Yeah, no, I think, this is, well, the world is absolutely changing. And when I was a student, I came out of Cambridge, and the first thing I did was translate Alberti. Everyone was interested at the time in because architecture seems banal, and everyone was looking to philosophy, to people like Wittgenstein. My professor, the head of chair of department, Sandy Wilson, was obsessed with Wittgenstein. And we were looking towards architects who were thinking architects, intellectual architects. And Alberti was that person, and we were looking to Alberti. And, I found myself surrounded by geeks because I couldn't afford my own, we didn't have laptops in those days, but you had your own console maybe. I was using the mainframe computer at Cambridge, and I was surrounded by these unbelievable geeks. We call them anoraks. They had no social skills, but they were astonishing. And I was just blown away by them and what they could do. And I was translating Alberti, but, and I think the point is this, the history of architecture is a history of revolutions. Alberti was a revolutionary. He changed the world. He introduced the Italian language. Brunelleschi invented perspective, and he wrote about it. And we think we should see the world as a form of kind of continual evolution or revolution. And really, we have a responsibility to be at the edge of it. So those who are kind of lost in the past need to recognize that Alberti was not a historical figure. He was really an iconoclastic figure in his own way. And I think that's the way forward, is to grasp the possibilities of the present and really think through that in a critical way and see where we're going to go. And as I said last in my lecture at USC on Friday, the irony, of course, about Alberti is his name ends in I and begins in A and ends in I. So I think we should wrap this up. I don't have at hand the schedule of what's going to come, but I can simply mention this. Next Sunday, we are going to have a collection of people talking about AGI and design, something that most architects and designers don't think about. Carla's going to be there, who was yesterday gave an incredible session on our advanced AI tutorial. Daniel, we got a bunch of people coming on, including, I think Smara's on that, and Daniel Bolajan, I think, and it's going to be an interesting discussion. Then we're moving on the Sunday after that to Blazer Guriakos, one of the kind of key players and one of the smartest people you'll ever come across. What I find interesting about this world is that you get people with PhDs like Demis Hassabis and so on, part of industry. And there's a collapsing of the difference between academia and industry, and also between arts and the sciences. And Blaze is right in there in a very open-minded way. He's interested as much about the mind as he is about AI. He'll be on, and he's fascinating. And finally, we end up with Carl Friston. Now, most people don't know who Carl Friston is, but he's probably the biggest name we've got in this series, and he's the most eminent neuroscientist in the UK, and I think the top 10 scholars in the world in terms of citation. He's really astonishing, and we're hoping to continue. I'm still hoping to get Fei-Fei Li in at some point, because she's pursuing the question of spatial intelligence, and I don't know where that's going to be, but we'll keep going. And the next semester, be working with the guys in Delft, in particular on philosophy and so on. So please just share the knowledge about digital futures. Go around and tell people that there are tutorials online. They can use them if you're teaching. send your students the link to these things and find out about it, because it's really important that we, as a community, learn to adapt to this new world and draw upon the kind of the enthusiasm and of all the members of Digital Futures. Let me finish off then with thanking all the people there today, especially Smara, who's streaming today, and others who were part of to Sarah and to Michael, who were part of the making the posters for today, and also to Bavaline and Gustavo, yourself, and the whole Digital Futures team. I think what is so heartening about Digital Futures is that people are willing to contribute to other people, to share their knowledge, to share their passion for architecture. And there are many others here today. I know that Vasco was teaching a workshop in the summer and so on. I think this is amazing, and let's hope we can build upon this and really share the information out there. Digital Futures is about recognizing that education should be available to everyone for free. Education shouldn't be a privilege of the wealthy. It should be a universal human right. I'm gonna call it a day now because my voice is going. Thank you for listening, and please join us next week. And thank you very much. All right, Samara, I think we can wrap things up. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.